Hi, everybody. My name is Marion Rappaport, and I'm joined by a number of members of the Oral History slash Local History Committee of the Ethelbert B. Crawford Public Library in Monticello. And what we're trying to do is to record stories of local families, as it were, who have been here for many years, or in the case of our interviewee today, have knowledge of the history of Sullivan County and in particular Monticello over the decades, in fact, over the centuries. So I'm pleased to let you know we're recording this on what's today? Today is the 12th of November 2023. And the prime person who we're going to chat with today is John Conway, who is a long time, whose family's been residents of Sullivan County for a long time, and who is currently the Sullivan County historian. And John, can we start with you telling us a little bit about your family, how they got to Sullivan County, and maybe when and where you were born? And then when you do that at the end, tell us how did you end up being Sullivan County historian?
Well, that's a tall order, but I'll try to take it one item at a time. Um, well, speaking of my family on my dad's side, they were Irish immigrants. One of my great grandfathers actually came to America first from Ireland around 1845 or so, and he worked in the tanneries as many Irish did when they first came over. He saved up some money, went back and got his family.
Could you
By
give us the names,
1850,
John? Could you give us names of your grandparents, if you know, and your dad's, when you mention people, so we
well,
have it?
it's easy because they all had the same name. They're all John Conway.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
and on the other side of my dad's family was John Mern. And again, there were a number of John Merns, but so by 18
Whoops. You froze, John.
in Forestburg, and both of them fortunately were able to uh, save up their money and eventually purchase their own farms. Although one of my great grandfathers, John Mason Conway, became the chief accountant for
We're having some trouble, John. You're freezing.
the other great grandfather, John Mern, bought a farm that eventually becomes the Apollo Plaza that many people remember in Monticello, just outside of Monticello. So they're Irish immigrants, came here in the 1850s. On my mom's side, it's a much more complicated story. We have Dutch and English and German ancestry. They were in Ulster County for many years and then gradually migrated to Sullivan County. And again, mostly farmers. Um, my mom grew up in Fallsburg. Her dad was a carpenter, a builder. He worked on many of the hotels, including that building at the Flagler that we'll probably talk about at some point. That new main building at the Flagler that was built in 1920.
Okay.
So about the county historian, that's a simpler story, I guess. My predecessor had been a county historian since 1972, I believe. And
Who was
what
that?
that was Bill Smith, William G. Smith. Um, the historian position is a political appointment, and so at one point, excuse me one second, Marvin.
Sure.
All right, I guess my wife got that. Can we continue?
Yes.
Okay. My predecessor, William G. Smith, was in the position for 18 years. And at one point in 1990, the election of 1991, the Board of Supervisors changed hands and they decided not to reappoint Mr. Smith, and they wanted a new historian. And they came to me at that point. I had been doing my newspaper column for a number of years, had been doing a radio show where local history was occasionally the topic, and was kind of beginning to get people excited about local history. And they asked me if I would be county historian. It took a couple of years, but they finally appointed me in February of 1993. So I've been in the position ever since.
Okay.
In case you're not counting 30 plus years.
Okay. I neglected to mention others who are on the call who are members of this local history committee. Lynn Skolnick, who was for many years the president of the board at the library, is on the committee and was joining us. Alan Barish, who was the director of the library for many years and is on the committee, is here. And Myron Gittell, who's on our committee, is here. And during the course of the next hour or so, they may have questions. John, did you tell us when and where you were born and where you grew up?
I was born in Hamilton Avenue Hospital. At that point in time in Monticello in 1952, there were two main hospitals, Monticello Hospital on High Street and Hamilton Avenue Hospital on Hamilton Avenue, as it were. And I was born in Hamilton Avenue Hospital, grew up in Rock Hill, went to Monticello schools, started out at going to kindergarten on Colonial Hill, which was utilized by the Monticello School District in the days before the Cook and Rutherford schools were opened. I'm not sure if kindergarten there was just for that 1 year or if it was more than 1 year, but I went there and then went to St. Peter's School on Liberty Street for 8 years and started Monticello High School in 9th grade. We were on St. John Street at that time. And then in 10th grade, moved into what we called the new school out on Route 42, which I just visited the other day, actually. It's very different from how I remember it, but
50 years old.
What's that?
Right? Like 50 years old. The new
Well, I
school.
remember you teaching there when
Yes,
my
only
senior
for-
year, I think, was the 1 year you taught him. You taught him Monticello just 1 year, right?
Yes, 1 year, 69, 70.
Yeah, that was my senior year. So I remember you.
Yeah, better than Vietnam.
I suppose so.
Okay. John, let's go back in history. When I taught school for that 1 year, we had a book called The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. And I asked every student to sort of picture the desk as the time machine and to go back in history to when the Indians were here, Native Americans were here, colonies, revolutionary days, and to even go back beyond that. And so in some ways, I'm going to ask you to take us on a time machine today. I know you know a great deal about the founding of Monticello, and which is sort of the central focus of the county. But we'll try not to limit ourselves just to Monticello. But why don't you start by telling us about the founding of Monticello and how it changed over the years into the 1800s?
Marvin, before John does that, can I just ask a question related to school? And that is, John, did you have a particular teacher, or was there something in your education that motivated you to love history, and especially the history of Sullivan County?
I think history was probably always my favorite subject. Probably we were introduced to history in 3rd grade. But I think the impetus behind my love of history was probably my dad. He was a real history buff. He read voraciously. We always had history books. We always had books in the house, and we were encouraged to read them and to create our own libraries. And I guess by the time I got to high school, if I had to single out a teacher, Dale Goodstall, who taught American history, would probably be the teacher who made the greatest impression on me. But I was fortunate. I had a lot of good teachers. I would say that there were very few bad teachers that I had over the years, and um, I
Thanks.
value my education, and I hope that I never lose sight of the value of that, and the gratitude that I hope I express the gratitude that I feel toward that. Um, I wouldn't trade it. Not to say that there aren't things that I might have done differently, but I wouldn't trade overall. The school was a good experience. My senior year in particular, for many years, I always said, if someone asked me if you had to spend one year over and over and over again, what would it be? I said my senior year in high school. Until I think maybe until I was my senior year in college, maybe. But yeah, I had a great time in school. So a lot of
Thanks.
kids have bad memories. I'm not sure why, but I can't even fathom having bad memories of school.
Great.
The whole thing was a great experience.
Good.
And I did not have Mr. Rappaport.
So now tell us about Monticello.
Well, Monticello is an interesting story. The Jones brothers come here originally from Connecticut through Columbia County. Samuel Jones, the older brother, was quite the entrepreneur, and he had an inkling that the movement that had been underway, we're now talking the early 1800s, 1801, 1802. There was a movement underway to create a new county. At that time, what became the village of Monticello was part of Ulster County, which was a huge county, took in all of what is currently Sullivan County, as well as what is currently Ulster County and other pieces as well. But there were attempts to form a new county as the population grew, particularly along the Delaware River. It was a long journey to Kingston, which was the county seat of Ulster County, to carry on any sort of business. And of course, back then, business had to be done face to face for the most part. Obviously, you weren't faxing and emailing people. So there was a lot of talk, chatter, and even legitimate efforts to form a new county. And Samuel Jones becomes aware of that, and he decides that would create some incredible business opportunities. And so he becomes he kind of maneuvers his way into what was known as the Newburgh-Coshocton Turnpike Corporation, and becomes part of that, and learns the route of that road, which was going to connect the Hudson River and the Delaware River. So Newburgh on the Hudson and Coshocton on the Delaware, which had been the earliest settled part of what would become Sullivan County. So Jones learns the route of the turnpike, and he understands that land along that route will be very valuable. And so together with his younger brother, John, they purchase a substantial amount of land along what they know will be the route of the turnpike. And they begin to lay out the streets of what they envision being a great city. And so now we're fast forwarding to 1803, 1804. Thomas Jefferson, one of the most admired Americans at this point, and they decide to name the community after Jefferson's home in Virginia, Monticello, which soon becomes corrupted into just Monticello. And its position on the Newburgh-Coshocton Turnpike, as it turns out, is probably the most important factor in the growth of Monticello into the county seat and into what is arguably the most important and most of the time the most populous village in the county. Although it does go back and forth with Liberty in that regard from time to time, but It was Samuel Jones who was primarily responsible for the creation of Monticello, although his brother's fame is longer lasting. And if I might, without rambling on, tell a great story about Samuel Jones and the early settling of Monticello in Sullivan County. So Sullivan County is eventually formed in 1809. There had been other attempts that the state legislature had not approved, but in March of 1809, the county is finally officially erected. And the first order of business, or certainly one of the first orders of business, is to pick a county seat. And at that point in time, the three most important communities in Sullivan County were Monticello, Thompsonville, and Liberty. And each one of them probably had a legitimate claim to being the county seat. But Samuel Jones was probably the shrewdest and the most influential man in the county at that point in time, with the possible exception of William A. Thompson, the judge who had founded what he called Albion, but what eventually becomes known as Thompsonville. And William A. Thompson was preoccupied building a very stately home for himself, and he really didn't get involved in the triangular contest to name a county seat. So it comes down to basically Monticello and Liberty, and Samuel Jones is pushing very hard for Monticello. And there were 5 towns in Sullivan County at that time: Thompson, Liberty, Mamakating, Lumberland, and Neversink. And each town had a supervisor, and each supervisor had a vote on the board of supervisors that governed the county. But they were unable to agree on a choice for county seat. And the wrangling went back and forth and arguing back and forth for so long that finally the governor says, this is ridiculous. We have to have a decision here. And since you guys can't make it, I will decide where the county seat will be. So I'm going to appoint a commission of state legislators. You'll both send delegations up and make a case for yourself. And then they'll make a recommendation to me as to which community will be the county seat, Monticello or Liberty. So Jones leads the Monticello delegation to Albany, and they plead their case. And on the way back, he meets the folks from Liberty who are on their way up. And he tells them untruthfully that they did not need to proceed because the decision had already been made. Now, that may or may not have been true, but it wasn't official. The Liberty folks turned around and went back at any rate. And Jones, Monticello ends up being county seat by default because Liberty never makes a case for themselves. So when this little act of deception on Samuel Jones's part becomes known to the other supervisors, there's an incredible and almost immediate backlash. So they refuse to appropriate money to build the county buildings for quite a long time, until the governor eventually intervenes again and tells them you've got to build the courthouse and the clerk's office. It takes probably a year and a half before they get underway with that. But more importantly, more interestingly, I think, is that following that, Samuel Jones, his life enters a downward spiral that ends with him being a drunkard and penniless and probably homeless, if not for his brother John, who took him in, and he dies more or less destitute. So kind of an interesting twist of fate there, that he goes from being the most influential man in the county to being a penniless drunkard, dependent upon his brother for what life he had. So kind of an interesting story of how Monticello becomes the county seat once Sullivan County is formed in 1809. And by the way, those wounds, they never go away. Liberty, I think, I see you chuckling, Marvin, but we can fast forward 35 years to 1844, and Alan knows the story well. By 1844, there were no supervisors left on the board from 1809. But when the county building the courthouse burns in Monticello in January of 1844, the supervisors say, you know what, we should revisit this whole issue. This was not legitimately decided in the first place. So Liberty should get a legitimate chance to present a case here. And unfortunately for Liberty, there were other, the county had changed dramatically in the 35 years. So Barryville and Forestburg and Fallsburg all lay claim to being county seat. And because of the divided opposition, Monticello is able to retain the designation. And interesting, Marvin, this is a little known fact, but there were a few editorials that were run in some of the Monticello weekly newspapers over the years that suggested that, and maybe this was, you could almost read this condescendingly, but if it was sincere, I think it was an important overture. They made the comment that Liberty had grown substantially in stature and in population, and that if it continued to do so, it might be deserving of being designated as a half shire.
What is
Orange
that?
County at that time was what was known as a half shire county. So it had two county seats. Goshen was the legal county seat and Newburgh was the de facto county seat. And a lot of governmental functions took place in Newburgh, just to give people an opportunity to not have to travel so far. So Monticello made this overture that Liberty might be deserving of being a half shire, and the folks from Liberty basically said, we're not interested in being a half shire. If we can't be the county seat, we don't want anything at all. So that was an interesting battle that went on at one point in time.
It's good stuff, John. Go back for a bit for me. Before we started chatting, you said that I had asked you about slavery in the county, and you told me something about slaves being present at the founding. And could you get into that? And also, I had learned in my case, 7th grade, Mr. Victor taught us that one of the reasons why Monticello was so popular was the fact that Route 17 was a state road that went through the village, was as I recall, 8 rods wide and 1 mile long. And that is why we had that very wide Broadway that other communities didn't have. Could you go through your time machine and tell us what it looked like in the early 1800s as it was developing? Were those factors?
Obviously, Route 17 is what grew out of the Newburgh-Coshocton Turnpike. And as they said, Monticello's location on the Newburgh-Coshocton Turnpike, which was not accidental, was the main factor in it being designated the county seat. Regardless of what Samuel Jones had to say, it was located on that road, which was the only improved road through Sullivan County at that time. So that was a huge advantage for Monticello, which Liberty didn't have. Although Liberty was perhaps geographically more centrally located in the county, it was not located on the Newburgh-Coshocton. So you're absolutely right. That was a critical factor, and that does account for why the road was so wide. It did become the state highway. In terms of slavery, very little written about slavery at that time. Of course, by 1827, slavery has been outlawed in New York State. And that was a gradual process that began much earlier, primarily through the efforts of men like John Jay and the New York Manumission Society. But there are accounts, a bit obscure perhaps, but in Quinlan, he actually mentions that the Jones brothers, when they began to clear the land to create their village, their uncle, I believe his name was Jared, if I'm not mistaken, was with them, and that he brought slaves with them. And there are a few anecdotes about Jared Jones's slaves, and one of them got lost, I think. I don't recall the exact details of the stories, but that's one of the references we have to slavery. And of course, we depend upon Quinlan for a lot of that information, and Quinlan's view of slavery was a little bit different from many other people, given that he was an avowed Copperhead later on, and he was probably pro-slavery, certainly more pro-slavery than anti-slavery, and much of the accounts that we do have from Quinlan about slavery are almost he writes about it almost in kind of a comical sense. He makes light of the institution of slavery and the plight of the African Americans and whatnot, which I think is easy to miss if you're not aware of Quinlan's predilections. Once you know what his political leanings are, you can kind of get a better handle on what he's saying and what he means by what he's saying in his history.
John, for those who don't know, tell us who Quinlan was and what did he do?
So James Eldridge Quinlan was the son of an itinerant preacher, grew up in Monticello, owned Kiamish Lake at one time, and he was the editor of the Republican Watchman newspaper, which was the one of the most prominent newspapers in Sullivan County, probably next to the Liberty Register, the most read paper in the county, and it was a heavily Democratic paper during the time that Quinlan and another man, Frederick DeVoe, who was his partner for a while, had the paper. And Quinlan was instrumental in gathering the history that becomes, and then writing it, that becomes the Bible of Sullivan County history. It's known as Sullivan County, published in 1873. It's broken up into a number of chapters, one chapter which deals with each of the towns, and then a few other chapters that deal with particular institutions like the D&H Canal or the railroad, etc. But without Quinlan's history, we would know very little about the early days of Sullivan County, its formation and early development, the industries that took place here. But once you learn about Quinlan's political leanings, some of the mysteries of that book, and Alan can speak to this also, people always wonder, given the time period the book was written and published, why there's such a light there's very little written about the Civil War. It's handled very lightly and very sporadic mentions, not much about the impact of the Civil War on the county, which was substantial. And I think it's all because of Quinlan's political leadings. He was a peace Democrat. He was a Southern sympathizer, a Copperhead. So he was anti-war, excuse me, anti-Lincoln, pro-slavery.
Yeah, just a footnote, Republican Watchman. The term Republican was originally used for what became the Democratic Party in the time of Jefferson.
Yeah.
So it was Republican or Democratic Republicans and so forth. So the idea that the paper might be Democratic leaning, you shouldn't be thrown off by the fact that it's called Republican Watchman.
Yeah, and
thank you.
Well predates the formation of the Republican Party, which obviously is much later in our history. So the Watchman begins life as the Whig, and then it becomes the Republican Watchman. There were other newspapers. There was the and at one point it was known as the Democrat Republican. There was also the Sullivan County Republican, but the Republican Watchman was typically a Democratic paper as opposed to the Sullivan County Republican.
What did Broadway look like if not the time of Jones, which would have been a single house, in the early 1800s? How did it develop? Was the courthouse built and then everything built around it? Or because of commerce, there were stores along Broadway that developed first?
Well, the Jones brothers were, as I said, really aggressive entrepreneurs, and they had an idea to actually give people lots who would come and improve the lots and set up a business. So Monticello became known as a merchant's village. It was mostly mercantile as opposed to factories or anything like that. And the courthouse was the central part of the village, and the park in the front became the gathering point. That's where the Sullivan County Fair was held, and so on until it outgrew the space. There were hotels along what becomes known as, at that time, was Main Street, the Newburgh-Sheckton Turnpike, and that's why the hotels were located there. Probably six or seven prominent hotels along that route at one time. But the interesting story about the Main Street of Monticello is, and the village itself. So the village is formed in 1804, and in 1830 it actually incorporates. So it actually creates its own government, has a village council, village board, with a president who would be the equivalent of the mayor today. But we're told, and again, we rely on Quinlan for this, that for many years in that era, the village became quite unkempt. People were allowing livestock to roam throughout Main Street, so you can visualize chickens and cattle just kind of roaming at will. Quinlan paints a pretty good verbal picture of it. And he credits his good friend and fellow Copperhead, A.C. Niven, who's one of Alan's favorite characters. He credits Niven with cleaning up the village and passing the village statutes that required people to pen their livestock and really to clean up Main Street. So for many years it was sort of a war zone, or resembled a war zone. And then after 1840, I guess, we begin to see it taking shape as sort of a real well-kept Main Street. And at that point, we begin to see the construction of churches, and of course, the fires come along later that really define the Main Street. 1844 is the first major fire. A couple pretty big fires in the 1870s that sort of reshaped the Main Street. And by the way, it does not become known as Broadway until about 1910, after the 1909 fire, when about half of Broadway is rebuilt. They christened it Broadway instead of Main Street.
When did the trains make it up here, John?
So the train is an interesting story as well, Marvin. Monticello had a history of being rebuffed by the railroads. When the first railroad into Sullivan County was the New York and Erie Railroad, which was surveyed in the 1830s and built in the 1840s. And by 1848, 49, it's complete through Sullivan County. But the original surveys included Monticello in the route of the Erie. Of course, it made sense to include the county seat. But for various reasons, when the Erie was built, the final survey took it up the western side of the county. And because the D&H Canal was in operation at that time in the 1840s, it was kind of at its peak, really, I suppose. The Erie was unable to get the right-of-way and had to go into Pennsylvania for a time. Monticello businessmen were so angered by this, by being spurned by the Erie, that there were editorials again in the Monticello papers urging the state legislature to forbid the Erie to come back into New York. They had crossed into Pennsylvania and built a substantial part of it on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware, with the intention of coming back into New York once they got north of the property owned by the D&H Canal. They could get the right-of-way again in New York. But the Monticello papers urged the legislature to deny them permission to come back into New York. So Monticello had this beef with the Erie. And then when the New York and Oswego Midland Railroad was being constructed after the Civil War, again, the early surveys took Monticello as part of the route, but because of where they were able to sell subscriptions or stock, the route eventually goes through Fallsburg instead of Monticello. And again, Monticello's left without a railroad. And so the businessmen decide that they'll take matters into their own hands, and they form a coalition with some businessmen in Port Jervis, and they in the 1870s they construct the Monticello and Port Jervis Railroad, which opens in 1871 or 72 with a depot on St. John Street in the area of around Fairchild Place, to what is today Fairchild Place. Not the depot that you may recall, but there was an earlier depot a little bit closer to Main Street. But it's not till the 1870s that Monticello ends up getting its railroad, and ironically, it hooks up with the Erie and Port Jervis. It was probably a really bad decision. It was made out of anger, I think, and had they waited a little bit and built a spur instead to Fallsburg, they would have had 5 miles of construction or thereabouts instead of 22 miles. It would have been a much easier run and might have ended up being a profitable route. It would have linked Monticello with what becomes the O and W instead of the Erie, and probably things would have turned out much differently for Monticello. But the Monticello and Port Jervis was never a profitable road. It went bankrupt a number of times, had a number of different names, and I guess ironically, it ends up being owned by the O and W after 1903. So fate kind of plays a hand.
Okay,
It's
John,
impossible to escape fate.
when you and I chatted earlier, we talked about, and I hope you're going to get into timber, tanning, and tourism. And that might be, I think that's probably after the Civil War. So if that is true, why don't you tell us what the county was like when the war broke out? Who might have gone, and are there any famous, members of the Union Army from Sullivan County?
We let's talk about tanning and timber and tanning, because they do predate the Civil War, and in case
Okay.
of timber by 100 years. So
okay.
Yeah, and timber really and probably have a minimal impact on Monticello, I guess, per se, but it's in the impact of both of those industries on the county, I think, are immeasurable. So timber is our first great industry. It goes back to 1764. And it starts in the Cushatunk settlement, which is the first permanent European settlement in the upper Delaware. Basically from present day Minisink Ford to Callicoon, about a 30-mile long stretch, was settled by some Connecticut settlers in the 1750s. And in 1764, one of the young men who had grown up in Cushatunk by the name of Daniel Skinner, who had become a sailor. He had gone to sea, and he had sailed in the Caribbean and the Atlantic, and he had served on the ships with these giant masts and the great sails. And he realized that the trees that grew on his property in the upper Delaware would make great masts. And an interesting thing was happening in America at that time, Marvin. The French and Indian War had come to an end, and the British, who were victorious in the war, had suffered great losses to their navy in 7 years of warring with France, not just in North America, but in the world. And they had to rebuild their navy. And so much of the timber that had been coming out of New England and feeding the shipyards in Boston, where American shipbuilding had long been centered. That timber was being appropriated now by the British. They were taking it back to England to rebuild their navy. And so the Boston shipyards were finding it very difficult to get material. And American shipbuilding had been shifting more and more to Philadelphia. So Skinner realizes that he's got a direct route to Philadelphia via the Delaware River. And he when he comes back to the Cushetunk settlement, he cut 6 of his best trees, which he thinks they're very tall, very straight. He thinks they'll make great masts. And he rolls them into the Delaware, and he figures they're going to float down to Philadelphia. He'll follow behind in a canoe. And when he gets down there, he'll gather them up and sell them to the shipbuilders, and he'll make some money for himself. It's a great idea, but it's very poorly executed, and he loses every one of the logs. He can't keep track of them in the river. It's a long way to Philadelphia, and there's some pretty treacherous parts of the river on the way. So he loses all of his logs, but he doesn't give up. He comes back and he decides, well, maybe he can build a raft out of those logs. He cuts 6 more trees and he builds a raft out of them. He hires another guy, and together they ride the raft down to Philadelphia. And that first trip takes them 8 days. They get down, they have 6 logs. They sell them to the shipbuilders in Philadelphia. They make 4 British pounds per log, which is quite a bit of money. People always want to know, well, how much is that in today's currency? That's a really hard calculation to make accurately, but I always put it in perspective by telling people, well, a school teacher in Philadelphia at that time, a fairly large urban area, would have made about 50 British pounds a year. So if you do the calculation, Skinner made 24 British pounds, 4 pounds per log, 6 logs, 24 British pounds for his raft, for an 8-day journey to Philadelphia, plus the time it took him to cut the trees and trim them, build the rafts. Still, that's pretty good money for that trip. So Daniel Skinner becomes a wealthy man because eventually he's able to make the journey not in 8 days, but in 3 days. That's the average journey to Philadelphia from the upper Delaware. And the rafts get bigger and bigger and bigger. So he becomes quite wealthy. And pretty soon everyone wants to get in on the act, and timber rafting becomes our biggest industry. And by the way, they raft timber on the Delaware from those humble beginnings in 1764 into the 1920s. So more than 160 years, they're still rafting timber, not necessarily to Philadelphia, but to other points on the river. And timber rafting employs, over the years, thousands of men. Millions and millions of board feet of lumber are rafted on the Delaware. And that shapes our county in more ways than one. Not only is it our first great industry, but obviously the cutting of those trees. And at first, they're cutting just pines. Skinner's intent was to cut pines that were suitable for mass, but eventually they're cutting pretty much any kind of softwood. Hardwoods were much more plentiful in the big cities. Softwoods are what they were looking for, and so we're cutting all kinds of trees, except probably for the hemlocks, which no one really wanted. Hemlock trees, they were kind of nasty. So we cut everything else down as part of the timber rafting industry. So not just economically does it impact the county and where people live and what they do for a living and how much money they're able to make. It also links us to Philadelphia in those very early days. We have a direct link to one of the most major cities in the country as the new nation is building, which gives the upper Delaware really an interesting advantage. And of course, it physically shapes the county because we're cutting down all the trees. And then beginning in 1831, we see the hemlock tanning industry, or the leather tanning industry that's fueled by hemlocks, moving into the county. So our first tannery here is in 1831. And hemlock tanning is a process that starts in the Berkshires. By 1815, a man by the name of Colonel William Edwards had brought it into Ulster County, and the way these tanners operated, and there were a number of families that created dynasties out of the tanning industry. Tanning, of course, is taking animal hides, most of which were imported from other countries, certainly other parts of this country. They weren't local hides. Taking those animal hides and tanning them into leather, using the bark of the hemlock tree and water to create what was known as a tanning agent or tannic acid, which was the integral part of the process. So those tanners learned early on that once you depleted the hemlock population in a given area, it was much more economical to abandon the tannery and to move to another area where there were hemlocks. So we see the tanning industry move from the Berkshires into Greene County and then Ulster County, and then by 1831 into Sullivan County. And we have 40 odd tanneries here by the time the Civil War breaks out. And the Sullivan County leather is so prized because of our great water and the nature of the hemlocks here, that we tan more leather than any county in the Union during the Civil War. And tanning becomes our great industry here. Thousands of men are employed in these 40 tanneries. We tan mainly what was known as sole leather that's used for the soles of the boots. And there's an old saying that the Civil War was won on boots tanned in Sullivan County. So we were ruled by tanning and timber for decades here. These are extractive industries that were pretty nasty to the environment. We're cutting trees. First, we're cutting everything but hemlocks, then we're cutting hemlocks. So by the 1880s, we've depleted all the hemlocks here, that has amazing and wide-ranging ramifications. And directly related to the tourism industry, which begins in the 1840s or 1830s and 40s, and is built around fishing to begin with. But taking down those hemlock trees is one of the factors in the demise of fishing here. We're renowned for trout fishing. In 1832, the largest trout in the world is caught in Sullivan County. And when that becomes national news, we have fishermen flocking to White Lake where that trout was caught by the hundreds. And those are our first tourists. That's what creates our first summer hotel. And the streams that flow throughout the county are great. They're plentiful with trout because the hemlocks, the way they grow, they canopy these streams in many cases, which keeps the water cool. Trout love cool water, cold water. And once we begin cutting the hemlocks down, the trout in many of the streams die. Calhoun Creek is probably the best example. The water temperature rises, even just a few degrees will impact the trout population. And White Lake has its own issues with the trout, which we can talk about when we discuss tourism. But we managed through some poor decisions to almost kill the trout fishing industry here, but before it's somewhat revived by the railroads. And that's a whole another story, which we can talk about when you're ready.
Okay, are we up to the Civil War?
Yeah, obviously we're tanning leather for the Civil War.
Okay.
The Civil War in Sullivan County, obviously we have no battles here or anything, but we do have, I think, three legitimate links to the Civil War. I remember doing a program at the library about Sullivan County and the Civil War, and my theme was that we had three distinct links. One, obviously, is the tanning industry. We tanned all of this leather that fueled the Union Army. Without us, there are no boots, which means there's no army. So we kind of win the war for the Union Army that way. We did send a considerable amount of men. We outdid our quotas on a regular basis whenever there was a call for men. There were regiments raised here. Myron Gattell, who is sitting in on the interview, knows well the history of the 143rd. He republished through his publishing company, Load and Go Press, the history of the 143rd. The 56th Regiment was probably the most famous. It was raised here. 10 of the 15 companies were raised here in Sullivan County. We had men in many of the other companies. Company H of the 28th Regiment, I think, was the earliest regiment raised, earliest group of men raised here in Sullivan County that fought in the Civil War. So we sent a lot of men. And then, of course, we have our third link would be Stephen Crane and his Red Badge of Courage, which is the really probably the seminal work of the Civil War, I think. And then, of course, the whole Quinlan and Niven Copperhead connection, I think, is another fascinating part of our history that is related to the Civil War. The anti-Lincoln, vehement anti-Lincoln sentiment that went on here. So we're really linked to the Civil War in many ways, and I think the indirect link and probably just as important, maybe more so, is the fact that after the Civil War ends in America, we see a rush to build railroads, and that's when Sullivan County gets the Midland Railroad, which becomes the O&W, which feeds the eventual Borscht Belt. Without the O&W and its origins in Weehawken, we don't have that influx of Jewish immigrants into the county that was so instrumental in building our economy for the 20th century.
We'll go there in a minute, but as one who lives a couple of miles from Stephen Crane Pond here in Forestburg, and knowing that he resided here, give us 2 sentences on Stephen, on his connection to the county, and why not only is the book important, but his connection to our community.
I'm not sure I can do it in 2 sentences, and there's one.
Well, whatever.
So I'll do the best I can, Marvin. So so Stephen Crane is the youngest of 14 children. His dad is a minister, and his dad, I guess, kind of runs afoul of the hierarchy of the Methodist Church, and he ends up in Port Jervis, which was not a prized pastorship, I guess, from what I've gleaned from reading about Crane. So his family moves to Port Jervis, but they build a summer home in Forestburg. And his oldest brother, William Howe Crane's a very accomplished lawyer and judge, has some very wealthy clients, and he himself purchases hundreds of acres in Forestburg, maybe 1,500 acres there, which eventually becomes known as the Heartwood Club, which I know you're familiar with, Marvin, living proximate to it, maybe on Heartwood Club property, or what was, certainly bordering it. At any rate, so Crane, his connection to Sullivan County is very early. He spends his summers here. He grows up here. He's only 8 years old, I think, when they build the summer home, and he spends most of his summers here. And much of his writing is influenced by his life here. And his earliest published pieces, he wanted to be a writer from his earliest days. He publishes his first poem when he's 8 years old. So he always wanted to be a writer. And his brother, Townley Crane, operates a news service in Asbury Park in New Jersey. And Stephen sends him dispatches from around the country, many from Sullivan County. And he writes some fiction, in the early days of his writing career, which are later gathered together, much later after his death, are gathered together in book form as the Sullivan County Tales and Sketches. And those are insights into life in Sullivan County during a time we don't have other people writing about the county. So, and to have someone with Crane's powers of observation and his uncanny writing for a young man. I mean, he wrote in such vivid ways that we have a great insight into our county that we otherwise wouldn't have had. But obviously his most known work is the Red Badge of Courage, which was the first novel, they say, that really treated war in a non-romantic way. He wasn't writing necessarily about heroes and heroic actions, but he wrote about fear and he wrote about blood, and so he treated it a little bit differently than it had ever been treated before, and that's why the Red Badge of Courage became so popular, I think. But he follows that. His next book is a short novel called The Third Violet, which is actually set in Forestburg, and not well received by critics. But I think a lot of their resistance to liking The Third Violet was that it wasn't a war story. They wanted another Red Badge of Courage Part 2, and he chose to write a love story, which read through today's eyes is a little stilted, granted, but I think it provides an insight into Sullivan County and its tourist industry here at that time period that we don't have otherwise. So it's Crane was his impact on the county is important. It's significant.
Great. John, as we're winding down a little bit, now we've finished the Civil War, we talked about Stephen Crane, you touched upon tourism as a function of the railroads. From the rest of the couple decades to the turn of the century, tell us how tourism developed in the 1800s and lead us into whet our appetite for what I hope will be a second conversation of the turn of the century and what we came to know as the Borscht Belt as Jewish immigrants came here and populated the area. But give us that piece between whatever it is, 1880s and 1900 or 1870s.
Yeah, that's a good way to do it because it was an evolution, obviously. As I said, tourism starts with that article in 1832. We begin to see these fishermen coming in, and by 1845, enough of them are coming to the county, specifically to White Lake, to fish and bringing their families and spending time. And remember, Marvin, that at that point in time, you really had to want to come to Sullivan County to get here. It was not an easy journey. There was no railroad into the county at that point. So the fact that people came here was an interesting fact because of the arduous journey it required. But at any rate, by 1845, a man by the name of John Beekman Finley opens the first summer hotel in the county in White Lake, and he's catering to fishermen. And then soon after, we see other hotels, most notably the White Lake Mansion House, open, and White Lake becomes our first resort. And then once the Civil War ends and the other railroads are built, obviously the Erie came along prior to the Civil War, but after the Civil War, it begins to actively promote the region as a tourist destination. America's undergoing the Industrial Revolution, and people are actually going on vacations. And so the railroad takes that fact and it begins to promote the area. The Erie promotes the Upper Delaware region as a sportsman's paradise, and the Midland turned O&W takes a different tact. And because of the influx of immigrants into New York City and the massive growth of the city, which far outstrips its ability to handle these people in terms of sanitation and sanitary facilities, et cetera. Disease is rampant in the city, and the O&W begins a promotional campaign based on doctors say go to the mountains. So whatever ails you, pure air, pure water, and pure milk are the remedies, and go to the mountains. So they for decades they promote the region around their railroad as doctors say go to the mountains. And we have fortunately many of those ads have survived, and that's really where our tourism industry begins to grow from those beginnings where it was primarily fishermen to this silver age that really by 1890 our tanning industry is gone, timber has waned considerably, and tourism becomes our primary industry, largely because of the railroad, its promotional efforts, and the growth of New York City, and the fact that people are getting sick. And again, I think that the reason the two areas of Sullivan County, one served by the Erie and one served by the O&W, developed differently, very differently, demographically, and eventually physically, is because of where the railroads originated. So Hoboken at that time, where the Erie originates, is known as the German city. It's heavily populated by German immigrants, and that's who we see coming up to the western side of the county. The O&W, on the other hand, originates in Weehawken, and Weehawken is located directly across the river from the garment district, where many of the Jewish immigrants who come into the city find employment. And so they're well acquainted with the O&W. They take the ferry over to the O&W and they come up to Sullivan County, and that's why we have the rise of Jewish immigrants here in the county, among other reasons. But that's why it's the particular area of Sullivan County that develops as the so-called Borscht Belt, developed where it did, because where the O&W Railroad originated. So that's probably something we can get into at another time. But the Silver Age, which is that early era, is built on the railroads. That's the way people got here. It was virtually the only way people could get here. And from 1890 to about 1915, we have a couple of hundred hotels and literally thousands of farmhouses taking in boarders. As late as 1900, we still have nearly 4,000 working farms in Sullivan County, and most of them are taking in boarders to help make ends meet. So that's our tourism economy in that Silver Age. It's becomes our number one economic engine. And it's built on the railroad. That's how people get here, strictly on the railroad. So most of the resorts are located somewhere proximal to the railroad, either the Erie on the western side. And again, those people are seeking recreational opportunities. And along the O&W, it's people who are seeking healing, people who have gotten sick. They're coming up for the fresh air, clean water, and pure air, pure water, and pure milk that the O&W is promising they'll find at the end of the rainbow, so to speak.
John, you've given us a tease for our next conversation, but let me just ask you to go back for one item. We talked about Monticello in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Was there anything about the village itself that you wanted to remark about from post-Civil War on? How did that change in that period of time, since there were no industries as such, as you said, in the village or around it? It was all merchants primarily. What was it like in the village in the latter half of the 1800s? Anything of note before we let you go?
Well, obviously a few things changed. So when the Newburgh-Coshocton Turnpike ceases to operate, and then we begin to see the transition to the state highway, we do see a change in Monticello, and a change in the complexion of Broadway, because those hotels that had served the Newburgh-Coshocton Turnpike, whether they were cattle drovers who were herding their cattle along the Newburgh-Coshocton or whatever, they were staying over in some of these hotels. And when the Newburgh-Coshocton ceases operation, as we get into the latter stages of the 19th century, those hotels kind of begin to struggle, and many of them close, to be reborn later once tourism begins to take hold. So that's probably, and we see this happening in several communities in Sullivan County. If we look at the Erie Railroad, Narrowsburg is an incredibly important stop on the Erie for many, many years, because in the early days of the Erie, if you intended to go into Pennsylvania to places like Honesdale or Hawley, Pennsylvania, you had to get off in Narrowsburg and arrange transportation. There was no rail line to take you there in those when the Erie was first completed. And so Narrowsburg develops this economy based on hotels that serve these people who need to stay over for a day or two until they can get transportation west. Once the Erie puts the spur line into Hawley and Honesdale, it's no longer necessary to spend the night in Narrowsburg. Those hotels begin to struggle. Some of them even close, only to be reborn later when the Erie begins to promote tourism in the upper Delaware. And we see kind of the same thing happening in Monticello. The hotels that had been business hotels, what they would call drummer hotels, which catered to businessmen, people who were traveling for business, they are reborn as tourist places. And Liberty, to a little bit lesser extent, I think, has the same phenomenon happen there. But that's probably the most significant change. Monticello, by the way, you talk about industry, has the only tannery in Sullivan County that actually continues to operate into the 20th century. So out of the 41 tanneries or so that we have in Sullivan County, only one lasts into the 20th century, and that's the one in Monticello down in what becomes known as Spring Street. At that time, it's known as Tannery Road. So Marvin, you would know it as the athletic field, or people a lot younger than us would call it Somerville Field or the Cook School. That general area was the location of the tannery in Monticello. And by the end of its run, it eventually burns to the ground in 1924, I believe. It was tanning book leather, and by that time they're no longer. They don't use hemlock trees anymore to the bark of the hemlock to tan. There are other chemicals that they've discovered that will do just as well in the process. So that's the industry. But very, very, very little industry in Monticello is known much more for its mercantile businesses.
Were there any, I'm going to let you go. Were there any names of individuals, political or business people in the late 1800s that stand out in your mind as having had a major role in Monticello at that time?
Well, sure. We talked a little bit about A.C. Niven, who's a fascinating character. His family, I think, still there's still vestiges of the family in the village. But certainly in our lifetime, there were Nivens living there. So A.C. Niven was instrumental in the early years. Alfred B. Street grows up in Monticello, ends up becoming one of the most renowned poets in America, becomes New York State librarian. The St. John family, Frederick St. John was a longtime merchant on Broadway, St. John Street, named for the family. And his nephew, Daniel Bennett St. John, goes on to become the first one of the superintendents of banking in New York State, and one of the founders of the New York Times. So Monticello certainly contributes people, and I know you've interviewed some more recent people who grew up in Monticello who have made significant contributions to America. But those are certainly some.
Great, John. Thank you. I think we'll wind down here, because we can only talk so long before losing one's voice, and appreciate your energy and your very, very informative conversation. We hopefully titillate and tease our viewers that we're going to get back together again soon and talk about, as we move into the 19th century. You mentioned the Borscht Belt. That triggers a whole lot of interest, which has now been resuscitated by Mrs. Maisel and so forth. And you and I and many others, and some of the others on this call, have done a number of panels on the Borscht Belt as we know it, which is mostly from 20s or whatever up through 1970s, maybe a hint of the 80s. So we'll leave that for another time. Is there anything I didn't ask you about the 1800s that you wanted to mention? And if not, we'll say thank you.
Well, I think we covered a broad range of topics, Marvin. I mean, obviously there's a lot more we could talk about. We could certainly delve deeper into a lot of the subjects, but I think you did a great job of keeping rein on me, and you did an admirable job of covering a broad range of subjects. So I look forward to talking about tourism, and of course we're not totally finished with the 19th century. Tourism has its roots there, so we would necessarily have to revisit that to some extent when we commence our second part of our interview.
Great. Don't leave us, John. I want to stop the recording, and then we can chat a little bit about where we go from here. Lynn, thank you. Myron, Alan, thanks for your presence and your interest. John, thank you for your wealth of knowledge. I mean, some of these things, I've listened to you for a long time. I learned a great deal today. And a lot of this, you went in different directions, and I found it fascinating, and we appreciate it very much. So thanks again. And for those listening, stay tuned. We'll have another session hopefully as soon as we can. Let me just hit the button here to turn off the recording.